What exactly the others are, what they want, and how you stop them are some of the core mysteries of the A Song of Ice and Fire books. In the last video on the channel, we talked about what I think the others are, and if you haven't seen that one, you may want to go check it out before this. What we're going to be talking about today is a lot of building off of that discussion, as well as some bits of information that I wanted to include in that discussion but ended up getting cut for time and things like that. What we covered in the last video was the question of what the others are, and I think I made a pretty compelling case that they are shadow babies. Likely green seer shadow babies cast with weirwood magic. The questions that we're going to be trying to get to the bottom of today include who exactly it is that is casting these shadows, and also what exactly happens when you cast a shadow and who's in control of it once it's out there in the world. If we can start to figure out these two questions, I think we could have the clearest idea yet of what the other's motivations might actually be. So by the end of this video, we'll have gone through every suspect that I see as reasonably likely at this point for potentially casting the others, and we're going to go through and try to see which ones set up the best story, which ones are the most likely, which have the most evidence, all that sort of good stuff. The intention is that by the end, hopefully you'll have a better understanding and can make up your own mind as to who you think actually cast the others. I definitely have my own opinions, but as I said, I'm going to go through every one that I think is plausible. A lot of these ideas and discussions are fairly new in the A Song of Ice and Fire theory community, so I would love to see a bunch of people discussing back and forth who exactly they think cast the others, if they're on board with my idea that the others are shadow babies. But that's actually the kind of thing I'd like to focus on a little bit more first, is what exactly goes on when we're casting these shadow babies. So we're going to focus on that, because that I think we can get to the bottom of a little bit quicker, and once we do that, we'll have more context as we go through that entire suspect list. The first point I'd like to make about all of this is just how well the idea of shadow magic lines up with how George talks about shadows as a metaphor. In Varys's riddle, he talks about how power is a trick, a shadow on the wall, but a small man can cast a large shadow. Talking to Tyrion, obviously, but using the idea of casting a shadow as projecting your power, which is, again, sort of what Stannis is doing. When he casts his shadow, he's projecting his power outside of his body to go and kill Renly. For a long time the king did not speak. Then very softly he said, "I dream of it sometimes, of Renly's dying. A green tent, candles, a woman screaming, and blood." Stannis looked down at his hands. "I was still abed when he died. Your Devon will tell you. He tried to wake me. Dawn was nigh, and my lords were waiting, fretting. I should have been a horse, armored. I knew Renly would attack at the break of day. Devon says I thrashed and cried out, but what does it matter? It was a dream. I was in my tent when Renly died, and when I woke, my hands were clean." So if you compare what Stannis is dreaming about to what actually happened when Renly was killed, it's very obvious that he was actually physically in the room viewing what was happening through that shadow. It really does seem like in this world what Varys is saying is literal. Power can be a trick or a shadow on the wall, and using a shadow as a projection of your power or your dark desires seems to be very possible magically. The more that I look into George R. R. Martin's magic, the more that I see he really does like to have it thematically match with some sort of core concept of reality, like the Hammer of the Waters is a big spell the Children of the Forest did during a war. And one of the legends about how the Children of the Forest called down the Hammer of the Waters says that they sacrificed a bunch of their own young. The idea of trying to cast a powerful spell in a losing war, doing so at the cost of a giant chunk of your young generation, well, that fits really well with the lived experience of someone who watched a bunch of people be drafted off into Vietnam. In universe, it may be a magical spell, but the cost of it is a reality. The cost of doing something powerful in wartime is a giant chunk of a young generation of your nation. George wants to remind us of the dangers of using power, which he shows us firsthand with actual power, but he also shows it to us with the dangers of wielding magical power. As I said, George likes his fantasy elements and his magic to mirror some sort of psychological or cultural reality. So once you start looking at magic in this way and looking at shadow babies being cast, it's interesting to go back and look at Varys's riddle and see how George is sort of having fun with this idea. Power is a trick, a shadow on the wall, and shadows are a way that you can project your power. This also isn't the first time that George uses this idea of casting a large shadow to mean sort of having a large influence. When Tyrion's walking into the feast when he's first introduced, he leaves by casting a large shadow. "I don't even know who my mother was," Jon said. "Some woman, no doubt. Most of them are." He favored Jon with a rueful grin. "Remember this, boy. All dwarves may be bastards, yet not all bastards need be dwarfs." And with that, he turned and sauntered back into the feast, whistling a tune. When he opened the door, the light from within threw his shadow clear across the yard, and for just a moment, Tyrion Lannister stood tall as a king. We also, of course, have the example from Late in A Dance with Dragons where Melisandre's talking to Jon Snow about the shadow he's casting on the wall, again using the idea of a shadow being cast as a projection of his power. "Ghost," he called, "to me." The direwolf looked at him as if he were a stranger. Jon frowned in disbelief. "That's queer." "You think so?" She knelt and scratched Ghost behind his ear. "Your wall is a queer place, but there is power here if you will use it. Power in you, and in this beast. You resist it. That is your mistake. Embrace it. Use it." I am not a wolf, he thought. And how would I do that? "I can show you." Melisandre draped one slender arm over Ghost, and the direwolf licked her face. "The Lord of Light in his wisdom made us male and female, two parts of a greater whole. In our joining there is power. Power to make life, power to make light, power to cast shadows." Shadows. The world seemed darker when he said it. "Every man who walks on the earth casts a shadow on the world. Some are thin and weak, others long and dark. You should look behind you, Lord Snow. The moon has kissed you, and etched your shadow upon the ice 20 feet tall." Jon glanced over his shoulder. The shadow was there, just as she said, etched in moonlight against the wall. So there we get a very direct comparison of shadows to projecting your power. And every man casts a shadow upon the world, it's just a matter of which type of shadow you cast. Sort of showing the issue with power that rejecting power is itself a choice to not do something with the power you have available to you. This is more or less the pitch that Melisandre's making to Jon. She's saying that you are leaving yourself weak, and if you don't use all of your power and leave yourself weak, you're not going to be able to achieve your goals, which, deep down, you know are the right thing to do, right? That's why she's saying, hey, let me help you achieve your full power. Now, obviously, this whole idea comes with many complications of how do you know that your ideas are right for everybody else, and all sorts of complex issues that we don't have time to get into right now. And I'm not here to tell you what you should do personally if a red-headed sorceress comes to you and starts trying to sleep with you, telling you how powerful you are. That's a personal decision you're going to have to make on your own. The reason that I bring it up here, though, is because this sort of interesting dynamic of whether it's better to leave power unused or whether it's better to take and wield that power for what you think is best is sort of an interesting comparison when you take it alongside another discussion about shadows. In this case, the Jungian shadow, which, for those of you who don't know, is what people refer to as the sort of darker sides of your personality. When George R. R. Martin talks about people being morally gray, it's because they have both a light side and a dark side. He recognizes that everyone has that shadow within them. And many people say that, in fact, to become the best version of yourself, you don't want to leave that shadow just completely abandoned and ignore it or whatever, bury it down. Instead, you need to embrace it and control it and tame it, to recognize these things about yourself so that you know what you're capable of and are in full control of that, rather than attempting to bury it down or pretend it doesn't exist. The idea being that these dark parts of ourselves, much like our actual physical shadow, are something that we can never fully escape. But by being aware of them and being in control of them, you can overcome the temptation and still choose to do the right thing. For example, say someone who has anger issues and chooses to acknowledge that and go to anger management and therefore becomes in control of their anger, and only uses it when it's actually useful and necessary. That, in theory, is the idea. You don't want to completely ignore your anger issues because then you might lash out and have anger problems, and you don't want to, make yourself so zen and completely remove that part of your personality because, well, then if you actually need to get angry if something is going wrong and you standing up for yourself would actually solve the problem, you won't have that ability to do that. But if you can actually fully control your anger and be fully in control of when you need to stand up and actually get a bit angry, and when you don't, well then, congratulations, you have taken control of that part of your shadow. This is probably a fine place to put the disclaimer that I am not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, but basically the idea of the shadow is the less than ideal parts of ourselves that we would like to hide or repress to present ourselves as our ideal version. At least you repress them if you don't take control of them. And in terms of talking about our story, one of the more interesting aspects of the shadow is what happens when you try to repress it or pretend that it's not there. This internal conflict between your shadow and your ideal version of yourself can actually lead to something called projection of the shadow, when you have a conflict and you project your shadow out onto the other, making it an external enemy to battle with. Considering this is a psychological concept that it would make sense for George R. R. Martin to know about, and he did choose to name the enemy the others, I think there's a decent chance then that these shadows that we see called the others are the otherized subconscious shadows of some of these people that we're going to be talking about throughout this video. If you watched my previous video, you probably remember how I went through all of the names that the others are called throughout the series, and basically all of them give us some sort of clue as to the true nature of the others, besides the name the others itself. But if this is actually what's going on and what George is playing with is the idea of psychologically projecting your shadow onto some other that you can fight with, rather than admitting it's a part of you, well then maybe the others are actually a bit of a hint as well. All of the other names that George uses for these things are giving us some hint as to their true nature, so it would make sense that the others is as well. And George R. R. Martin's naming convention is nothing if not literal. He named the North, he named the West, the Westerlands, he named the place with all the Riverlands. So it really wouldn't surprise me if, yeah, all of the names that he calls the big bad, the others, are on some level or another fairly literal. The White Shadows, the others, the cold shadows, the cold ones, all of them really do describe the others. Especially if they are indeed dark parts of the psychological shadow that have been otherized or ejected from the body. That certainly fits with what we saw when Stannis was casting a shadow, so it would make sense that these other shadows are similar. Keeping these ideas in mind, I think, will definitely give some good context for trying to explore what the motivations of these shadows may be. But that I really do think is what's going on magically and thematically when the others are being cast and when these shadows are being cast. It is your subconscious shadow being projected out into the world, and in this case, projecting it onto the others, and they're probably being cast to achieve some dark desires. To the extent that the others are evil, that evil is going to come from the fact that they're the projections of the shadows of real human beings. And I think exploring why exactly those shadows were cast and what those human beings were doing or what their desires were is going to be important to figuring out the others. So I'd like you to have all that context in mind as we're going through the suspect list later, but I really do think that adds some more good evidence for the others being shadows in the way that I'm talking about, and just to really drive home the point of what I'm talking about here, we're going to listen to George R. R. Martin talking to Stephen King about the nature of good and evil. I think his words here really should drive home the point that the big bad of his story, the others, aren't some like externalized evil spiritual force, but rather probably a projection of the conflict within the human heart. Or, in other words, the psychological battle with your own shadow.
My fantasy series, of course, is often compared to Tolkien, and I love Tolkien. I'm the biggest fan in the world of Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's view of good and evil in that is evil is externalized. It comes from Sauron or Morgoth before it, and orcs who are absolutely irredeemable, and the good people get together and stop the orcs, and most of the good people are good. I've always been more attracted to gray characters, and I've said in many interviews, well, I do think the battle of good and evil is a great subject for fiction, but in my view, the battle for good and evil is waged within the individual human heart, and it's our decisions. We're all partly good and partly evil, and we make decisions every day, and we may do a good thing on Wednesday and then an evil thing on Thursday, or a selfish thing, and it's all very complicated, and that's kind of the approach that I've taken. But I'm also a huge fan of Lovecraft, and I think you are too from reading some of your books, and I see Lovecraftian influences. But Even though I see the Lovecraftian things, when I look at your books, the real villains are the people. Misery. Annie Wilkes is what a horrifying creation. I mean, under the dome, maybe you could say the aliens are the villains who've trapped it, but it's really the horrible, ordinary people under the dome who start doing these incredibly horrible things to each other. The Mist is another one. I mean, there's the Lovecraftian monsters, but it's the crazy religious woman in the thing who really makes things 1,000 times worse. So I don't know. What are your views on the nature of evil? Is there an external evil in the universe? Is it Sauron or Satan or Cthulhu, or
Well,
is it our own fucked up human natures?
So you can see in George's own words there, he likes his evil to come from within the human heart, rather than some externalized force. The others being a projection of the shadow in this way, and therefore a result of our fucked up human nature, fits exactly in line with what George is talking about here. This is just another reason I love the idea of the others being green seer shadow babies so much. If you take it in context with what George was just saying right there, it basically allows him to take the bad parts of our human nature and turn them into the giant Lovecraftian force of monsters that we have to deal with. The Lovecraftian ice demons could literally be a projection and therefore a result of human nature. For longtime viewers of the channel, you'll know before I came up with the others as shadow babies theory, I was more in line with the idea of they were probably some sort of tree spirits much like the She. Potentially, they were being given a body by the babies that were being taken, or some other sort of sacrifice, sort of like we saw in the television show directly. I think that this is the natural assumption to make, and it makes a lot of sense. The old gods seemingly are nature gods, and the others seem connected to the old gods somehow. They act like the Fae, which are sort of spirits of nature, and George himself has compared them to the She, which are again spirits of nature. I think with everything we have presented, it's reasonable to take this as the most likely option, which allows George to perfectly set up the actual option behind the scenes, giving us a nice red herring that he knows we'll take. If the motivations of the others did truly come from them being some angry nature spirits or angry tree gods, well, that would sort of remove a lot of the human element that George seems to like when he's dealing with good and evil. Things like the quote that we just saw from George R. R. Martin there were the things that I could never make sense of when I was viewing the others as some sort of nature gods or tree spirits or whatever you want to say. But now, viewing them as shadows and the projections of human desires for immortality or power or whatever it is winning a war, well, that actually fits to me a lot better, and that's why I've pretty much fully moved on to viewing the others as literally green seer shadow babies, rather than like weirwood spirits or whatever in some more abstract way, just to sort of illuminate my thinking and why I've changed my mind on this to longtime viewers of the channel. The reason that it's important to discuss here, though, is because we do also have to figure out not only who cast these shadows and why, but also who's actually in control of the shadows now. Because if you have to fight a giant army of icy shadow babies, it's important to know if they're controlled by some sort of godly spirit that's evil, maybe some nature spirit that just wants to go back into the trees, maybe the desires of some ancient people from the past, or perhaps just the dark desires of all of the collective of humanity, and they want to destroy everyone in front of them. Each of those different scenarios would lead to a very different conflict and a very different sort of resolution. All of them at this point do seem plausible, but we're going to try and get to the bottom of what I think is actually going on. And that's where I was getting at. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for it to be actually being controlled by some sort of like outer god hive mind that flows through the Weirwoods, because that sort of removes what George is talking about human nature being the true evil. In terms of who's likely to be controlling these shadows, it's not going to be some externalized force, so it seems like we're left with the most likely options being the man strapped into the tree, the woman using the shadow binding magic, or potentially some sort of spirit from within the tree. But if it is something coming from within the tree, it would somehow have to fit with what George was saying about how the real evil is from human nature itself. So, while we're going to be taking a look at a lot of the real humans who are suspects of doing this, I do think first we should take a look at the tree's role in this whole thing and what exactly is going on with the magic and the hive mind of the Weirwoods. I do really like the idea of the Weirwoods and the others, therefore, being some sort of like alien parasitic hive mind. That's something I've been open to over the years, but At the same time, I think all the stuff that we've talked about recently with the others being green sea or shadow babies, and everything we're going to discuss by the end of this video, is a lot more well set up and leads to a lot more interesting story. At this point, I view the Weirwood system as more of a magical tool to be used or a source of magical cosmic power, rather than like some sort of home for tree spirits. And to bring up something I talked about a bit in the last video, I do actually think in George R. R. Martin's world with the way magic works, you could build up more magic into a system by storing souls in there. Souls, life energy, whatever you want to say, seem to have magical power in this world. And when people die, they think they go into the Weirwoods, and people are often sacrificed to the Weirwoods. And honestly, it really does seem like people are going into the Weirwoods on some blood magic or spiritual level. We also get confirmation of the existence of long dead children of the forest existing in some sort of bird related hive mind, which could definitely be connected to the Weirwoods because the green seers and wargs are connected to the birds as well. So, yeah, it really seems like there is some sort of hive mind in there, but it seems like it's probably made up of all these people who have died over the ages and gone into it. If what they did was took this already magically powerful world tree and started storing their dead in there and strapping up the occasional body to it to make those bodies immortal and grant magical power, well, that could be some sort of corruption of an already existing natural magical system. I talked about the Weirwoods as a whole in a video about whether the Weirwoods are good or evil a while back, and basically the conclusion that I came to is that the Weirwoods are likely just power. It's just magical power, and whether it's good or evil depends on who's using it. It seems like in Westeros over the years, mostly what the Weirwood Net's power has been used for is controlling people and keeping the Starks in power, and making sure more blood is fed into the Weirwoods, likely to keep the Greenseer bodies in the roots alive. Even if you like the idea of immortality or a place where your soul can go to join some immortal hive mind, in this case it seems to come at the cost of blood sacrifice of many people constantly. So yeah, you could argue that the way the Weirwood power is being used at the moment and throughout the entire age of Westeros that we've been living in has probably not been that great. But that doesn't mean that someone who was a good king and set up a new Weirwood system, or a new world tree based system of some sort, couldn't build a good system that was used in a good way. It's just at the end of the day power, and it's all about how you wield it. But the weight of the old ways and the Weirwood system that's been used this way for so long is still weighing on society. The shadow of the past, if you will, is still out there very strong in Westeros and projecting itself and projecting its power and still controlling everybody. At least until it can be defeated and people can be freed from this system. But the point of that entire little discussion there is just to say that if there is indeed some sort of hive mind within the Weirwoods and the Weirwood system, I think that it's there because of all the souls that have been put in there over time, and therefore that hive mind is probably not something alien or some sort of outer god or some old god or nature spirit. It's probably some sort of representation of the collective unconscious of humanity, all of the people who have ever lived, and all of their ideas that are still weighing down on the people of today. When you think about the old ways of society and tradition in the real world, that's basically exactly what they are. So, if the Weirwoods are the center of the old ways magically, and then the hive mind within them is made up of a magical representation of the collective unconscious, well, that really does fit with what I was talking about earlier, how George likes to sort of mirror his magic to psychological or human realities. This is just George basically saying that, yeah, the fact that we live in a society that is built around the ideas of all the people who have ever lived before us is something that comes down through the ages and has an effect on us to this day. Once again, some of the magic in George's world that seems to have a bit of its basis in some psychological reality or some reality of the human condition. To bring that all back into the topic that we're trying to talk about today here, who could possibly be in control of these shadows? If the shadows are controlled by something from within the trees, I would suspect that whatever's within the trees is the hive mind collective unconscious of all the people and the children of the forest who have ever worshipped and gone into the Weirwoods. In this context, it is definitely possible that that's what's entirely powering the others, the sort of shadow of the entire Old Ways culture as a collective, and I think that would make a really cool and interesting enemy. At that point, if these are literally the shadows of the collective unconscious, then they're battling the darkest desires of the very dark Old Ways society, essentially given life by this dark magic. That idea is also pretty consistent with what we see of the shadow babies cast by Stannis and Mel. Stannis' shadows seemingly are cast to fulfill his darkest desires, things that maybe he wouldn't be willing to do on his own, but his shadow is willing to. So, with both Stannis' shadow and with the others, as I talked about last video, we're left with this interesting question of who's in control, and the options seem to be maybe the mother who cast it, maybe the father who cast it directly looking through the shadow and physically controlling it, or maybe it's the darkest desires or the unconscious of the father who cast it. The darkest desires cast out into the world so that they can act on their own will through some other being. Even the way Stannis talks about the experience of casting his shadow out to do that sort of mirrors what they're talking about psychologically, where you're projecting out these dark parts of yourself so that you can ignore them and act like it was somebody else doing it. It is pretty terrifying to imagine the darkest desires and the shadows of the old kings of winter, or some of these candidates we're going to talk about, existing out in the world acting of their own desires. That's a very terrifying enemy that does still fit within a human on human conflict, where the entire problem is, as George said, our own fucked up human nature. So we will definitely be talking later on in the video as well about some of the balance of power between who's in control of the shadows, the mother, the father, the trees, something else, right? We'll go into that as we go throughout these suspects. But yeah, I do think if the trees are in control, that's probably on some level what the trees actually are. As we go through all of these figures from the ancient past who could have cast shadows, keeping in mind this idea of the shadows of the past hanging over everyone through the old ways, it all does fit really well thematically, and we should keep that in mind that whoever cast these shadows is probably someone who is going to make that thematically hit home as well. People like the Night King, Bran the Builder, Ancient Kings of Winter, right? All of these ancient figures we're about to talk about are people who would very literally represent the shadows of the past and past conflicts still hanging out over the world and controlling the way people do things. But now I do think we've set up enough of the context that we can finally dive into the question that we've been trying to tackle for a while now. Who exactly is it that cast these others? So, just as a reminder, we're going to get into several suspects here, and basically, we're going to be entertaining all of the ideas and following them out to their end and seeing what it leads to. All of the people that I cover here, I think, are definitely plausible and worth discussing as someone who could be casting the others that we see out in the story. Everyone that I'm going to cover on this list, I think, both has the ability to cast these shadows using Weirwood magic, and also would lead to a fairly interesting story if they were indeed behind it. There are some that I think are better than others, but at the same time, all of them are really interesting, and I'd love to see you guys go back and forth a little bit in the comments about which ones you think work best. So, the first suspect I'd like to cover is someone who I would imagine regular viewers of the channel will know is high on my suspect list. That is, of course, Bran the Builder. I've talked a lot in the past about how Bran is seemingly being set up to be a Bran the Builder for the New Age, and in the television show, we're told explicitly that he can never have children, which would definitely mean that he can never have shadow children either. If Bran the Builder laid the foundations for this magical system that has kept the Starks in power for 10,000 years, kept people feeding blood to the Weirwoods, and has been controlled by the threat of shadows hanging over everyone's head for this entire time, well, Bran not being able to cast shadows and therefore not being able to introduce this threat into the new system would definitely be something that separates him from the old Bran the Builder. This idea of not trying to control a society through fear in this way might be something that George wants to drive home. I especially like this contrast being set up if it is indeed true that Bran manipulated himself into falling. If a future Bran is the one who's warging into those crows that are constantly asking Bran for corn, and therefore encouraging him to climb the towers, and therefore setting him up to eventually break his back and be unable to cast shadows, well then that would make this just a time travel version of a self-sacrifice. Bran making the choice to take away his ability to ever do this. I think that one of the things that George R. R. Martin would view as making a good king is being willing to sacrifice yourself and your own well-being for the land or the people that you govern. So it wouldn't surprise me if we're seeing Bran do that on a time travel-y level as one of the things that prepares him and makes him a good king. I had mentioned earlier how someone who was building a new world tree based system could maybe set it up in a better way. And by rejecting taking that immortality that comes with strapping yourself to the world tree, and also rejecting casting shadows from the world tree, I think Bran could be setting the world up for a better system. We've already seen him in his own head wary of the idea of this immortality, and as we said, he's physically incapable of casting shadows, whether by his design or someone else's. So it does seem that the new system is being set up in a better way, and I think it's the coolest if it's coming from the actions of a future Bran. There's already a lot of Odin symbolism with Bloodraven and Bran being strapped up to the World Tree, and doing this bit of self sacrifice would just drive that home even more. If Bran had to sacrifice his legs in order to be the perfect person to lead the world into a new and better age, well, that would fit really, really well. Bran the Builder having potentially cast others in the ancient past to enforce the old ways and enforce the Kings of Winter's power is something that I think is a really interesting setup to contrast with Bran's inability to do this. But that's not the only reason that Bran the Builder is a really interesting candidate. It also fits really well because it would literally be the shadows of the past still hanging over everyone. He's the founder of the Stark dynasty, they're the kings of winter. It would make sense if winter is coming originally meant, hey, if you try to take the Starks out of power, those icy, wintry shadows are coming to stop you. If the wall's ward is powered by Weirwood magic, and the Starks are the ones tied into the Weirwood magic, and all the blood sacrifice into the Weirwoods is going to keeping Bran the Builder and potentially other ancient Starks alive down in the roots, as well as powering the wards of the wall, well then this entire setup is just basically a Stark beneficial system and the shadows are a really important part of it. Therefore, it does make a lot of sense for Bran the Builder to have done this. This is the system that cemented his dynasty's power. They've been in charge the entire time that this system has been in place. The Weirwoods are still sacred to this entire system. And if you take a look at the Children of the Forest, this was around the time that they were signing a pact with the First Men. I talked about this in a recent video that I dedicated fully to Bran the Builder, and now maybe many of you are seeing why. If you want the full version, you can go and check it out, but one of the things that I brought up was that I think it makes a lot of sense for Bran the Builder, or whoever founded House Stark, to have existed around the time of the Pact, when the war with the Children of the Forest ended, because this is when men started worshipping the Weirwoods, this is when the old ways were first established, and it seems like the Starks have been in charge ever since then. They're the magical dynasty in power centered around the Weirwoods, so it only makes sense that their reign began when everyone started worshipping the Weirwoods with the help of the Children of the Forest. And Bran the Builder seemingly had the help of the Children of the Forest according to the legends. He is also the only one who is apparently capable of speaking their language. This is particularly interesting because, well, the others that we saw in the prologue seem to be speaking the Children of the Forest language, which could imply that they were cast either by Children of the Forest or Bran the Builder himself. Either that, or maybe because they are cast out of the Weirwoods as Weirwood shadows, they're speaking this naturey language. It is possible that that's just what's going on, but at the same time, it could definitely point to involvement of the Children of the Forest or Bran the Builder. It also works really well because, as I've mentioned before, Daenerys in the show had to sort of face the consequences of all the fiery magic that has kept her dynasty in power for all this time. She had to deal with the consequences of the dragons, and I think it would thematically fit really well if there was a similar thing on the icy side, where the Starks had to deal with the consequences of the icy magic that's kept their dynasty in power this entire time. Finding out that the threat of the others hanging over everyone's head is something that's been used to keep the Starks in power this whole time would be a pretty crazy twist, and our Stark characters would have to reckon with that. Bran the Builder being alive down in the crypts of Winterfell as a source of many of the others that are out there in the world would definitely be a really interesting thematic point to bring all of that home and force them to reckon with the situation, potentially killing Bran the Builder and destroying the entire Weirwood system that has kept their family in power for the entire time, as the only way that they can save the world from the Long Night. That would be a really interesting decision for the Starks to make. And it also would bring the conflict nicely home around Winterfell, which is something that did happen in the show, but it wasn't super satisfying. Possibly because they didn't set up all of this magical stuff that we've been talking about. Imagine if instead of what we got at the end of the show, where they're surrounded in the Godswood, everything is all but lost, and then Arya jumps in out of nowhere, instead the all is lost moment could drive them all down into the crypts as like a final layer of protection. a final place to flee to and just try to hide. And many people have already speculated in the fandom that, yeah, maybe they could get down into the lower levels of the crypts and then find a cave that connects to all those other caves, and maybe down through the crypts could actually be their escape route if Winterfell is lost. And then they could survive and go south, and then they come back and win the war another day. I think, though, that those caves and an escape route is what we're gonna think that they're gonna be doing. We're gonna think that they're trying to get out of there so that they can go fight another day, but when they actually get deep down there, they're going to find a chamber, much like Bran found, full of bodies that are sustained by the roots. And once they kill those bodies, it's going to eliminate the shadows. That's a much better kill switch and another interesting twist that could suddenly end the war in the same way, but would be much more well set up and satisfying. If Bran the Builder or some other ancient kings of winter are the source of these shadows and are still sustained by the Winterfell weirwood down in the crypts somewhere, I think that some version of this ending is probably pretty close to what we can expect. It makes sense of what we saw in the show when you factor in the fact that they were, for whatever reason, completely unwilling to establish any of the Weirwood magic and they just left that entire side of it all alone. It's why Bran's story didn't make sense, it's why the magic stuff didn't hit hard at the end, it's why the others' resolution was unsatisfying. But once you add in this element, it makes it all come together really well. That feels like a much better kill switch than what we saw in the show, but it also does sort of build to a similar conflict resolution, where there is a sort of kill switch type situation that makes all the shadows go away. It's just that rather than the kill switch being the shadows themselves, it's the bodies strapped to the trees who originally created them. You might also need to take out the tree itself, or possibly if George wanted to get really ambitious, you would need to take out the entire system of trees and then replace it. I would consider all of those possible, but at this point I do tend to think the idea of taking out the bodies to make the shadows go away is the big climactic situation that he's going to set up. And then possibly replacing the world tree with a fresh one that's not corrupted by blood magic is going to be the thing that actually gets the seasons working in order again. I put out a video a long time ago about how the heart tree system as a whole seems to control the seasons because, well, they have temperature controlling magic on display. We've already seen that with the ice magic that's connected to the Weirwoods. And also, we have a situation where the seasons are the heartbeat of the planet, and you have a heart tree that's a big world tree. And so, if the heartbeat is corrupted, you assume that the heart tree is corrupted. And if you can fix the heart tree, you can probably fix the heartbeat. I plan to have another video revisiting that topic now with some fresh ideas and everything that I've talked about in recent videos connected into it, but yeah, that's the general idea. This could lead to a situation where you get your big climactic end to the threat of the others, sort of like we got in the television show, but better, and then you still get that sort of rebuilding process afterwards that establishes it's not only important to win the war, you have to build a better system afterwards to make sure that it doesn't happen again. We're obviously speculating pretty far out into the future here, but that's the general way that I see it going. I do, as I said, have a video planned where I'm going to go into more detail, but overall, I do think it's going to involve the planting of a new world tree, the leadership of an enlightened King Bran who now recognizes the flaws of the old ways, and the building of new ways and the planting of a new world tree. For all of that to happen, though, this old system needs to be destroyed, and I think the old Weirwood system that produces the others and has all these bodies down in it, one way or another, is going to be destroyed in the Long Night. As I said, there are different ways that this could go, but one of the most thematically interesting would be if that core heart tree and the bodies that were casting the others were down in the crypts of Winterfell. You have to take out the Winterfell heart tree, and you have to take out the bodies that are preserved by it. It's also just the only logical thing that they would do if Winterfell is completely surrounded on all sides by the army of the dead. There's only one place to go, and that's underground. They try to hide in the crypts and they start digging away at those collapsed levels of the crypts to get deeper and further away from the army of the dead, and eventually they would be chased down deeper into the roots where Bran the Builder or these old kings of winter could be, and suddenly they've been chased directly to the kill switch that can solve this problem at the last moment. That was basically what happened in the Godswood at the end of the television show, but personally I think it would be a lot more satisfying if they were being chased down underground into the crypts, and you thought the battle was completely lost until they were able to find the actual source of the others down there in the crypts. For all of the really interesting thematic reasons and the fact that it would bring everything home and tie up the story in the depths of the crypts of Winterfell, which feels like it's really cool and really well set up, Bran the Builder is definitely on the S tier of the suspect list. Like, There's not any suspect that I consider better than Bran the Builder, there are only a few that I consider pretty much as good. So we'll definitely be bringing up Bran the Builder more, I'm sure, but let's move on now to another suspect who is somewhat related the Children of the Forest, who are said to have turned the trees into warriors in their war with the First Men. And of course, as we mentioned, it seemed like those others who were brutally killing Waymar Royce were speaking the language of the Children of the Forest. So, is there any reason to suspect that the others we see trapped north of the Wall aren't still those shadows sticking around from that original war who were driven north? Maybe that's what they did when they armed the Watch with obsidian, they drove them north, they, along with Bran the Builder, built the wall, but maybe those shadows that were cast out that we still see to this day were the same ones from that war who are cast with the intention of completely destroying humanity. That would certainly set them up as a giant natural force of evil that is still the result of human actions and sort of a cycle of revenge. Which, of course, is one of those things that George really does like to drive home. The cycles of revenge and the puppet strings of the past, as he talks about, are the things that really influence characters and cause all sorts of issues. So maybe it really is the result of this ancient war so long ago that's causing the issues to this day. The first men fighting with nature and the children of the forest could be the thing that they're still having to deal with the ramifications of. We do have it basically confirmed, in my opinion, that the children of the forest were creating others at some point, so there's definitely a strong case to be made that those others we see out there are actually just the original creation. We don't really need any further explanation. The issue that I have with this is pretty similar to the issue that I have with mostly viewing the others as tree spirits. It sort of removes that human agency from the equation. If the others that we're going to have to deal with at the end of the story were cast by the children of the forest with the intention of destroying humanity, to me that's less of a human conflict than it would be if they were cast by someone like Bran the Builder to maintain the Stark's power. It just feels thematically like it fits less well. But as I said, we do have it confirmed that they were creating others, so again, a really strong case. If I said that Bran the Builder was S tier in terms of being a candidate to cast the others, I would say the Children of the Forest are probably A tier. Still a really strong candidate, and we do have confirmation of them casting others, but as I said, it's not as perfect thematically as Bran the Builder is to me, so that's what knocks them down a tier. It removes a bit of that human psychological conflict. The next suspect we should talk about, who is pretty directly related to the Children of the Forest, is the Green Men, who we got our first glimpse of in House of the Dragon Season 2. The little antlered dude running behind the weirwood. In terms of people who would seemingly be powerful enough with weirwood magic to have cast the others, the Green Men are definitely pretty high on the list. There are basically two reasons you could look at as to why the Green Men may have done this. Either in the original story, where the Children of the Forest and the Green Seers turn the trees into warriors, maybe that was just a bit of a mistranslation and it was actually the Children of the Forest and the Green Men. If that's the case, well then yeah, the story would say that they're the ones who created the others. But at the same time, that's not what it says the Green Seers, and I think directly it makes a lot of sense that the Green Seers could turn the trees into warriors by sleeping with Shadowbinders, so I don't personally think this is a mistranslation, I think that it was probably actually the Green Seers. The other reason, though, that I think it could potentially have been the Green Men is basically a similar thing to what we talked about with Bran the Builder or the Children of the Forest. It could be essentially pact enforcement or old ways enforcement. If the threat of the others hanging over everyone is what they felt was necessary to get all of the men to worship the Weirwoods and constantly feed blood into the trees, well then maybe the Green Men would have helped cast the others to ensure everyone follows the pact that was signed on the Isle of Faces. This does definitely make a lot of sense. The pact was signed where the green men live, the others seem to be an important part of everyone following the old ways, so maybe they did have something to do with it. But the problem I have with this idea is, you could say the same thing about Bran the Builder or the Children of the Forest, both of whom I think were also probably present on the Isle of Faces, and both of whom I think are more likely to have cast the others, for both the reason that it makes it better thematically if Bran the Builder did it, and also we're straight up told the Children of the Forest did it, and we're never told directly that the Green Men have done this. There are a lot of little things that I feel like add up to pointing to other suspects being more likely, but one of the big ones to me is just I don't think that this conflict is going to thematically resolve on the Isle of Faces. it feels like the other's conflict is probably going to thematically resolve at Winterfell or the Wall. At least that's my speculation. That's what we saw in the television show, and I think there are other roles for the Isle of Faces that make a little bit more sense. To be clear, though, I'm not dismissing the idea completely. The Isle of Faces is definitely like top 5 most likely locations for the other's conflict to resolve. It's just not number 1 or 2. I've talked in the past about what I think the role of the Green Men actually is, and there are a few different things they could be. The Isle of Faces may be a seed vault for a new potential world tree if this corrupted world tree system that we see today ever goes badly. Maybe someone could go to the Isle of Faces and get a sapling for a new world tree, which may be needed by the end of the story. In addition to this, I think the Isle of Faces could serve as a place where Bran could go back in time and communicate through the wind in the trees to people who could actually understand him. I think that there's a good chance that the Order of the Green Men is focused on being able to talk to the trees because, well, when Howland Reed went there, he learned to talk to the trees from the Green Men. So, if Bran can speak through the trees and the Green Men can talk to the trees, and Bran can go back and communicate into the past, well, then the Green Men's existence would give Bran the ability to influence the past. And I think that's probably more of their role than actually being the source of the others. In addition to this, we also did see them trying to warn Daemon about the threat of the others in the north, which wouldn't really necessarily make sense if they were the source of the threat, unless of course the threat has just completely gotten out of their control and they now want it destroyed. But at the same time, again, I don't think they were the source of the others. The reasons that they could be the source of the others, I think, work better for other candidates, and resolving the whole problem on the Isle of Faces feels less set up to me than resolving it at somewhere like Winterfell. It also remains to be seen whether the Green Men are actually humans just wearing antlers or whether they're an entirely different species. If they're actually just an order of straight up humans, maybe they get bumped up a little bit more, but we'll have to wait for further confirmation of that. If they're an entirely different species, I'd say they might get bumped down even a little bit more because, again, I think that George is going for a more human on human sort of conflict rather than any interspecies type of war. All that said, I think I'm gonna put them probably in B tier as a suspect. Keeping in mind that everyone who's made this list is someone who I consider plausible and worthy of discussion, I'm gonna have them a little bit lower than the other options we've talked about so far. Speaking of which, I'd also like to knock out another suspect who I think is pretty much on the same tier as them, which is Bloodraven himself. Bloodraven's a weird one. He could end up much higher on the tier list. He's someone I could be convinced to move around quite a bit, I think. He is definitely allowing the creation of new others by not stopping Craster for, however long Craster's been doing what he's doing. You would think he could have sent Cold Hands or somebody or warged a bear and taken him out. At the same time, though, his goals do seem to be leading humanity through the long night, whatever that entails, and his protege Bran ends up as the king in the end, so seemingly his plan does work. There are some really interesting scenarios which could deserve their whole own video discussion at some point that would involve Bloodraven casting others for various reasons. But actually casting others directly and allowing them to passively be cast by somebody else are two fairly different things. Bloodraven may see the others returning and growing in numbers and realize that it's the best way to lead to a permanent solution to this issue, and that could be what he's doing, but that would be very different from him actually going out and kickstarting this entire thing physically himself. He is seemingly allowing these shadows to grow in number, but I'm not sure he's physically casting them himself. But at the same time, he definitely has the ability to do so, and if I had him in here for a suspect interview, I would definitely have him under oath tell me, when is the last time you were in contact with Shiera Seastar? Was it before or after you were linked up to the Weirwood trees? Because he is linked up to a Weirwood tree, and he definitely has connections to a sorceress woman who could be out there learning to cast shadows. So maybe if there is an icy sorceress somewhere in the north doing this today, it could be Shiera working with Bloodraven. Potentially. Again, I think this is a low likelihood, but at the same time, if George wanted to do this, he would have done enough setup where he could reveal a few more things, and then all of a sudden, everyone would be like, oh, I guess Shiera Seastar and Bloodraven are still working together, and she's still alive somewhere in the north. That's not completely out of the question. In a way, it would be very George R. R. Martin for the Targaryen family to be so obsessed with prophecy, including apparently knowing about the icy threat to the north, only for one of their descendants who's also obsessed with prophecy, to end up in the north being the one who's actually the source of this icy threat. That would be pretty funny. So, for those of you who are waiting for Bloodraven to have his dark turn and reveal that he's evil, well, maybe start thinking about this and how it could work into your theories, because yeah, he in theory could have been out there with Shiera Seastar casting some sort of other army out in the north that we have yet to see. Or if they are the others that we have seen, we have yet to have it revealed that they come from Bloodraven. It is just such a compelling idea that could take the story in a lot of weird, interesting directions. And the more that I talk about Bloodraven, the more that I am tempted to move him up a tier or two. If his name started with A, honestly, he might be A tier. But no, it's Bloodraven tier, he's top of B tier. But there is no getting around the fact that he's had the power to stop Craster for quite a while, and he's allowed this all to go on. This is one of the key realizations that I had a long time ago and I really needed to think about, and I've talked about it a lot on the channel because it made me realize, oh, well, if Bloodraven is allowing the others to get stronger when he could clearly stop it, then clearly his entire goal can't just be purely stopping the others. If he was trying to stop the others completely, he would have probably stopped Craster in his tracks a long time ago. So that's a bit weird and leaves us with a bit of a mystery as to what Bloodraven is actually up to. And the most reasonable solution, in my opinion at least, is that what he's actually trying to do at this point is bring this conflict to a head so that we can arrive at some sort of real permanent resolution, rather than the current system where the others exist in small numbers and are kept away by this giant magical wall that requires a bunch of blood sacrifice. And there are these bodies strapped to trees, some of which are immortal by their own choice, some of which might be being tortured and immortal forever not by their own choice. There's lots of problems with this current magical setup, and I think if he brings this conflict to a head, maybe he could actually lead to a better solution in the end. At least I think that's his goal. Finding a permanent resolution rather than the temporary resolution of the wall and the old ways and this entire setup of blood sacrifice to the weirwoods. If the others are shadows projected out from the bodies in the roots of the weirwoods all seeking their immortality, well, then they're a natural result of this system, and that means that the goal needs to be the system coming to an end. And perhaps the others coming back, at least in some amount of force, in order to bring down the wall, is necessary for this system to be brought to a permanent end. That could be what Bloodraven's working towards. Would that lead to him actually creating others on his own with Shiera Seastar? I don't necessarily know, but I don't rule out the idea. You could almost look at it sort of like a lie by omission, right? He's allowing Craster to create others even if he's not doing it directly himself. Is that so different from him creating others directly himself? I don't necessarily know that it is. Again, everyone that I'm bringing up here, the Green Men, the Children, Bloodraven, are all, in my opinion, really good candidates, but Bloodraven is just lower on the list of very good candidates, in my opinion. Now, in that entire discussion, though, of Bloodraven and what he's allowing Craster to do, we reach another interesting point of this discussion of all the suspects. Much like we have confirmation that in the ancient past the children of the forest were creating others, it seems like we have pretty good confirmation at this point that someone is creating others with Craster's sons. This feels like one of the few confirmed things we know about the others. So, who is it that's out there creating these others? Craster's sons are definitely the male portion of the casting, but the mystery we have here is who is the woman. Just because of the fact that we know the others are taking Craster's sons, and we know that Craster's wives refer to the shadows as the boys' brothers, I'm gonna put Craster's sons in like S tier for casting the others, but as I said, they're only half of the equation, so we'll move on quickly from them because that just feels like it's open and shut. And the far more interesting part of that equation is who started this deal and who was originally taking the boys, and who's probably casting the shadows with them. As I just brought up, if Shiera Seastar was working with Bloodraven at some point, maybe at some point she left him there in the cave, went rogue, and set up some crazy deal with Craster. Maybe that's what's going on. If that was the case, it would be pretty crazy, but at the same time, Bloodraven does sort of imply he hasn't been in contact with Shiera Seastar for a long time. Maybe then again, though, if she did go fully rogue and leave him there in the cave, that's what he's talking about. I don't know, a lot to unpack there, but in any case, I'm gonna put Shiera Seastar roughly around the same tier as Bloodraven in terms of suspects casting the others. If she was casting the others with anyone, I would imagine it was probably with Bloodraven. So, if there is someone doing it with Craster's sons at this point, It could be her, but I actually think there are a couple better suspects. There is the very creepy idea that it could be Craster's own mother. Craster comes from a wildling village called White Tree, and this is a place where the weirwood has a giant mouth that's big enough to fit people in or lambs or whatever, and when John looks inside, he finds a bunch of burnt human bones. It's true that you burn bodies when people die, and you often see the bones in the roots of the weirwoods, but not usually in the mouth. And that's a little bit weird. Maybe it is the same ritual, or maybe it implies some sort of culture of feeding people to the weirwoods. If the others are as connected to the weirwoods as we assume they are at this point, well, then it sorta does make sense that Craster's culture of sacrifice to the others for protection might be something that White Tree just does. That's very speculative, but I have heard it brought up that he had to learn this from somewhere. Another aspect of this theory that I do think works quite well, though, is how George R. R. Martin seems to be aware of and often highlight how cycles of trauma or abuse or whatever are often passed down and then replicated and passed on again. So if Craster doing this to all of his daughters is because it was done to Craster, and is being done to his sons in some weird magical way by his mother, well, that would sort of explain Craster's backstory. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't necessarily put it past George to try make us feel a little bit bad for Craster a few books after we saw him killed and all celebrated it. That feels like a thing he might do. I think the fandom would mostly agree Craster is at the top of the list or very near it for the most irredeemable characters in the entire series. But at the same time, if you found out he basically had no choice in the situation because his very magically powerful mother had been doing the same thing to him and set up this system and demanded the sacrifices, maybe you would feel a little bit bad for the guy. Again, it doesn't excuse anything he did, but it feels like a thing that would add a shade of gray to Craster's character that currently is not there. It's possible that Craster is doing what Craster does because that's what was done to Craster. And maybe his own mother did some sort of creepy dark magic, and then eventually became more powerful, and this is the sort of setup that they have where she's casting these icy shadow children, and Craster is creating more babies for her and for himself, and it's a whole big messed up white tree family other factory that I don't want to think about too much. This isn't necessarily super well set up by the text, but it is a plausible option, and I think it's worth considering. I'm gonna throw her down in C tier, and we're gonna call that Craster's mom tier. The other option, though, that I actually like best in terms of who could be casting others with Craster's children, is actually another figure that we've heard about in the books the Night's Queen. We've talked about this in recent videos, but just to drive home the point, there is plenty of setup for the idea that the Night's Queen of ancient legends could still be alive today. Melisandre thinks of herself as not mortal and how she's practiced her sorcery for years beyond count. And we have ideas like glass candles and weirwood magic that can seemingly grant immortality on some level or another. So, would it really be that crazy if we have a fiery immortal sorceress in Melisandre, and her counterpart, the Night's Queen, is an icy immortal sorceress as well? Both of them could be powered by some form of magic that keeps them immortal and sustains their body. We see Melisandre not needing to sleep or eat, and that's in her own head, so it's unlikely she's lying about that. This is a form of magic that's well established in this world. We also straight up have a character in the books today, Catelyn Stark, who has been resurrected as Lady Stoneheart. And if we were to find out that if no one took out Lady Stoneheart, and she was still around 100 years from now, would that necessarily surprise anyone? If no one takes her out magically, I doubt that her body's ever gonna starve to death or decay and somehow die because of that. She's seemingly sustained by some weird form of magic. So, in addition to this, as I talked about in the last video, George R. R. Martin commissioned an icy version of a Melisandre figurine at one point, and that definitely implies an icy version of a shadowbinding sorceress who's going to be important. So, an icy counterpart to Mel would be an immortal shadowbinding sorceress, which is exactly what the Night's Queen sounds like. Whether you want to compare her to Melisandre, or to Lady Stoneheart, or to those green seer bodies down in the Weirwood Roots. In any case, there's a decent chance that the Night's Queen could be alive. There's magic in the books that would explain how that could happen. The reason that I brought up Stoneheart, though, is because I actually want to make an interesting comparison between the two. Stoneheart is pretty obviously an example of how terrible revenge can be if you allow it to consume you. She is entirely hellbent on getting revenge for her family and the way that it was destroyed. So, if George wanted to have the others be some big bad that's entirely intent on destroying all of humanity, but still wanted the conflict to be on some level something that is thematically resonant and a human on human conflict, well, then maybe at this point, the Night's Queen is still out there, but she is entirely consumed by revenge for the Night's King and everyone who was working with him, and what was done to them when they lost their war. This would mirror her to Stoneheart and would make the shadows that she cast entirely intent on destroying humanity, as part of basically a giant cycle of revenge, which is one of the things that is, as I said, causing so many problems in these books. It's the puppet strings of the past that are causing them to dance and causing them to fight with one another. Tyrion and Oberyn talk about this when he's in prison, and it's one of the things that I think George is trying to get across with all of the conflicts in these books. It would make sense then if on the magical level this was just an amplified version of a giant revenge cycle taking place. And the shadows being cast are cast from someone who is magically animated, but very angry about something that happened to them a long time ago. I brought up at the end of the last video that it's interesting how Jon Snow's storyline might be showing us how someone who's trying to do the right thing and is a good person could be walked step by step into becoming the next Night King, being at the Night Fort casting out shadows trying to take his power for the greater good. It may be the case that Catelyn turning into Lady Stoneheart can foreshadow how the Night's Queen can end up in the state that we're eventually going to find her in, where she's this magically animated woman entirely consumed by revenge. And if George does want the others to be a truly evil army that needs to be defeated, well, then they could be fully intent on destroying all of humanity, because the Night's Queen at this point would look at all of humanity the way that Catelyn Stark looks at all of the Freys. When she's introduced, we see her hanging someone who had nothing to do with the Red Wedding. She doesn't care at this point who was actually directly responsible for the thing that's made her upset. The only thing she cares about is getting revenge on all of the Freys because she views them as all connected. So if the Night's Queen has this view towards all of humanity, well, that would be very terrifying. And in my opinion, it's the best way to arrive at the solution of these shadows or the others want to wipe out everyone. That's what seems to be the case in the television show, and it is what George said in his initial pitch letter, although I again don't put that much stock into that. But if it is true that the others want to wipe out everything that we would call life, I think revenge on a giant scale like this is probably the reason that that's happening. What would make this particularly interesting is if the Night's King himself was also still alive, which again, there is decent setup for him to be for all the same reasons. There's a giant weirwood seemingly at the Night Fort, encased in ice, so if weirwoods can sustain bodies and encasing someone in ice is traditionally the way that you preserve a body, well then someone strapped up to these weirwoods and encased in ice inside the wall may indeed still be alive. This is something that, again, I talked about way back in some old videos for longtime viewers of the channel. When I talked about originally how the wall was built, I did notice a lot of the foreshadowing of there seems to be bodies that were put in the wall as some sort of punishment, and it really does seem like there are others inside the wall or coming from the wall in some way. The wall seems to be a source of the others. And now that I recognize the others are shadow babies, it all just falls into place. There were these bodies who were tapped into the weirwood magic from the weirwoods inside the wall, and they may have been casting others, which would make sense of the story that the Night's King was sacrificing to the others. He was probably causing the others to come back. Obviously, when you write that story down in the history books, you can't tell anyone exactly how that was done. You don't want everyone to have the recipe to do that again, so you gotta make something else up. So, they're like, oh no, he's doing other sacrifice magic, we gotta stop him. And then when they did defeat him, they could have just stuck him and everyone who was working with him inside the wall and froze them right there. That would, in their mind, solve the problem. And if you want to argue that, oh, there's no way they would just freeze someone inside the wall forever and assume that the problem was solved, I have two words for you: arson ice axe. That's literally the exact thing that they did, and we have it foreshadowed that that might be exactly what they would do. The Night's Queen may have escaped this, and she is therefore immortal, sustained by whatever magic it is, but she's out there forever trying to get revenge and free her husband, who is still alive, trapped and tortured forever inside the wall. That would also be really compelling. I especially like this idea because it would then make the others' conflict the exact same conflict as the Starks in the early books. A mother and her sons marching south to free their father from prison. And of course, take revenge for everything that was done to him. To me, that would just be really cool on a level that I think George R. R. Martin would just love. So, yeah, the idea of the Night's Queen wanting revenge for the Night King, it really, really works really well to me. Also, just in terms of like awesomeness factor, in terms of writing a cool story, I think that the idea of these bodies being trapped in the wall as some sort of punishment forever until someone can free them is also really compelling and fits really well with a lot of the theming. And there are some stories that hint at this exact sort of thing. I brought up one of them earlier, but it's not even the only one, and honestly, it's not even the most direct one. The stories that we have of people being put inside the wall as a punishment are Arson Isaacs, who was trying to break through the wall and dig his way through, and they just sealed him up inside the wall, and the rumor is that you can still hear him there to this day. And of course, there's also the 79 Sentinels. The Sentinels were deserters from the Night Fort who went south and expected that they were going to find refuge at the keep of one of their fathers, but instead he turned them in and sent them back to the wall. As a punishment for desertion and all the bad things they did along the way, they strapped them up inside the wall forever, handed them a horn and a spear, and froze them into the wall, so that they could eternally stand watch. So we directly have the 79 Sentinels supposedly being bodies frozen in the wall, eternally standing watch. And the first time we see the others, Will has pressed his face hard to the trunk of a sentinel tree that is leaking sap onto his cheek. The sentinel tree, the 79 sentinels in the wall, people strapped to trees in the wall projecting the others, being in a sentinel tree when the others are first seen, the sap pressing to his face, giving weirwood imagery. Basically, the 79 sentinels are tree coated people who are stuck inside the wall forever alive. All of the connections are there, and if this is what George ends up doing, you could say it's very well foreshadowed. So, yeah, there's a decent chance that at least a chunk of the others that exist out north of the wall are cast from bodies who are currently stuck inside the wall, which would mean that one of their goals is probably to bring down the wall and free their bodies from this eternal torture. The Night's Queen could have the deal she has with Craster's taking his son so that she can cast more shadows to boost the numbers to try take down the wall. And maybe the reason that Bloodraven allows her to do this is because he agrees with that goal in the long run, of bringing down the wall and killing the bodies that are stuck inside of it. We do have to talk more about what I think the conflict between the Night King and the Stark in Winterfell was actually about, but that's an entirely big tangent that I've touched on in the past and will in the future, so if it feels like I'm brushing over that for now, don't worry about it. The point is, there's a really solid chance that the wall itself is a source of others because of the bodies strapped to the weirwoods within it. And these bodies may be stuck inside the wall as a punishment because if you find out your magical enemy has made himself immortal and strapped himself up to a tree, you might just freeze him there where he can't do any more damage. The idea of a magically animated wife who is immortal and forever hell-bent on revenge for her husband and the horrible way he was defeated and punished, yeah, that does make Stoneheart sound directly like a foreshadowing of this Night's Queen figure if George would choose to introduce her. It may sound completely crazy, but at the same time, someone is taking and making use of Craster's male babies to produce shadows. Who else would be doing that? There's only really a few options, and this leaves the Night's Queen, in my opinion, incredibly high, like S tier on the list of people who may be controlling and casting the others. She may be in control of some others cast with the Night's King way back in the day that are still out there to this day, or she may be out there still creating her own new army trying to free her husband from within the wall. Or, potentially, roll with me here, they took all of the people who were working with the Night King and they froze them into the wall like 79 Sentinel style, and she's going to be trying to free them because she was friends with all of them. But then they took the Night King back to the Stark crypts in Winterfell because he was a Stark. So not only does she want to take down the wall, but she also needs to get to Winterfell and down into the crypts, giving us the same resolution point as we talked about earlier with Bran the Builder. You can see how once you realize this conflict is likely about these bodies that are immortal down in the roots of the weirwoods somewhere, you realize that yeah, there's a lot of really interesting ways it can go. many of them revolving around real human drama and human nature in the way that George R. R. Martin talked about. The Night's King and Night's Queen relationship and whatever happened between them and the Stark in Winterfell, all of that is really interesting setup for some personal stories and really interesting conflicts if they're at the heart of whatever's going on with the others. Those conflicts could be definitely just as interesting as the Bran the Builder conflict that I set up earlier, and I think are way more interesting than something like, oh, I don't know, the Children of the Forest just did it because they were at war with the First Men. Something like this adds a little bit of extra stakes and personal involvement to it. It would also then again give us a kill switch, much like Bran the Builder would make a kill switch his body at Winterfell and the Winterfell Weirwood. This would make a potential kill switch for at least a good chunk of the others to be the Weirwood at the Night Fort that we see in the Black Gate. There's a decent chance that the Night's King's body is still strapped up to it somewhere, so if you could burn that thing and destroy his body, maybe the others cast from him or the Night's Queen would go away, and maybe her magic would stop and she would cease to be animated and die eventually, or something like that. We did see Melisandre take off her necklace and just collapse into dust in the show, so if the magic animating either Melisandre or her icy counterpart were to just cease to exist, it would stand to reason that something like that might happen. This idea of the bodies that cast the others or the tree that they're specifically linked to being the kill switch definitely adds another really interesting wrinkle to the whole fight with the others that I think fits really well and could wrap up the conflict much quicker than like a fully drawn out war. Once they figure out what the others are, solving them might actually be just about getting to the trees and killing the bodies and the trees. At that point, it also would make the bringing down of the wall into a good thing because it would expose the bodies within the wall and allow you to actually deal with them. And also, that would make a lot of sense of someone like George R. R. Martin, who grew up in a world where one of the most famous walls was the Berlin Wall, which everyone can agree it was a good thing when that was taken down. So, yeah, I could see George R. R. Martin, with his lived experience, being very in favor of the idea of the wall coming down actually being the solution, even though for a long time everyone had been told no, the wall must stay up, the wall is the only thing keeping the world safe. I think George R. R. Martin will definitely have the wall being taken down as part of his solution. He can say all he wants that it's really Hadrian's Wall that inspired the wall, and I'm sure on some level it is, but let's not pretend that the most famous wall of George's own lifetime didn't have some influence. It was a real life wall that was major world news when it fell in 1989, just a few short years before George R. R. Martin started writing A Song of Ice and Fire, where he put a big massive wall. I'm gonna go ahead and say it at least popped into his mind. The times between the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11 were generally considered to be a very optimistic era in America and the world overall. The Cold War had ended, people were looking at a chance at peace, and generally people were very optimistic. This came as a direct result of the fact that the wall fell and the Cold War ended. Think of that in A Song of Ice and Fire terms. The fall of the wall leads to the end of the Cold War. That Cold War that everyone was terrified of, that's been looming and looming forever and will surely destroy the entire world if it ever kicks off, but it never quite has just yet. Yeah, that Cold War. Much like the Berlin Wall, we're told that the division and the big magical ice wall is very important in keeping this Cold War from kicking off. But what if it's actually not? What if it's actually the case that the fall of this wall would also lead to an optimistic new era? When you realize that this is what was going on at the time that George was starting this story and thinking about all of this stuff, it's almost unreasonable to think that it wouldn't be on his mind. So, considering he's talked a lot about how he likes to write what he knows and put real life experiences into his stories, I think there's a pretty good chance he took a lot of what he was feeling at the time and put it into the world building of Westeros. I could see the fall of the wall in Westeros leading to a similar new era with a chance for a new way for the world. In our real world, it led to an era of, as I said, incredible optimism, and people felt like there was a chance for genuine peace in the world unlike they had ever known in their lifetimes. And for quite a while, they were right. Some people like to argue that A Song of Ice and Fire is pessimistic, but I would argue that's just because the big optimistic twist at the end hasn't happened yet and fixed everything. Up until we get to the point in the story where the wall falls, the conflict can be resolved, the shadows can be dealt with, the old ways can go away, and new ways can spring up and begin to be born, well, we're not going to reach that optimistic new point because that's the old, fucked up era that needs to change. That's part of the story that George is telling, and you sometimes need a big, dramatic, world changing type event like the fall of a giant magical wall to do that. Just to be clear, though, I do think that George's version of the Cold War will probably kick off. We're going to get the full World War along with the fall of the wall and then the new optimistic era. I think that George is definitely highlighting a lot of the ways that things can and do go wrong before he shows us that, well, society can always grow past that if it's willing to. Also, though, I don't think it's going to be just a fully optimistic happy ending. He has said it's going to be bittersweet, and I think it's going to cost the lives of many of our characters and destroy some of the characters who are left alive in the process. So, yeah, it's definitely going to be bittersweet, but for the world, I think it's going to have an optimistic tone at the end because, as I said, the wall can fall and the conflicts can finally end. It's fitting that this story that was born of the early 90s would leave on this open ended, optimistic feeling after the fall of the wall and the conflict was over, because, well, that's the point in time that George was actually at when he was planning the thing. As someone who had gone through Vietnam, having the draft, being a conscientious objector, the civil rights fight, the Cold War, and then by this point in his life had gotten like 2 years of no longer worrying when the nukes are going to fall, well, yeah, it feels like that's the right point in time for him to say, hey, let's tell a story where the world's really messed up, but then at the end, everything is way better and looking more optimistic. I think that generally this story is, as I said, a baby of this optimistic era that was the 90s. So, in A Song of Ice and Fire, should we really be that surprised if the fall of the wall also eventually leads to the end of the Cold War in the North? This war with these ice demons that are bringing the cold. It's all just right there. It's all stuff that would be definitely on George R. R. Martin's mind when he was beginning this story. So I think, yeah, this is stuff that would probably be a part of his original big plan. I think that the only reason that he wouldn't mention the Berlin Wall as one of the wall's inspirations is because it would give away far too much about what's actually going on, and that the fall of the wall would actually be a good thing. The others being literally produced from within the wall in this way makes that hit home even harder, along with the reality that when you build a wall between yourself and other people, you otherize the people on the opposite side of the wall. And that's one of the things that George has already explored with John getting to know the wildlings. I think there's a really strong case to think that at least a good chunk of the others are cast from within the wall. So yeah, the Knight's Queen, the Knight's King, they are definitely both on the S tier of this list, and if they are the actual source of the others, then the solution to the problem probably resolves around the Night Fort, which would be an interesting place for everyone to collapse to when the wall eventually comes down. As I said, I do need to discuss all the potential circumstances around the conflict between the Night's King and the Stark and Winterfell, but that's something that's going to be its own video coming soon, so just make sure you're subscribed for that. I will have to move on from talking about the Night's King now, though, just so this video doesn't double in length. One quick little bit of tinfoil, though, for you all that I do have to throw in here, because in this context, it is kind of funny to imagine that Arson Isaacs, his plan wasn't actually to try and dig all the way through the wall. Because it's a bit ridiculous to imagine that he was just walled in and never noticed. Like, how hard is it to turn around at least once in the amount of time it takes for them to freeze an entire wall of ice around you? So, imagine that actually he wasn't trying to tunnel all the way through the wall, he was trying to tunnel to the trees at the core of the wall so that he could strap himself up there and magically gain his immortality, thus explaining why people say that you can still hear him inside the wall. It would be kind of funny to imagine that he heard some of these stories or figured out the magic or something like that, and that's why he didn't care if he got walled into the wall, because that was his goal. He was trying to live forever at the center of the wall for some reason. Completely tinfoil, but I think it's a fun idea. It also could be the case that he's a little bit of a hint as to the solution to this problem. There's a guy named Arson Isaacs who's digging his way into the center of the wall. And if you were trying to talk about ways to take out a tree that could be inside that big wall, well, fire or an axe are the two ways you would do that. So basically, his name is Fire Ice Axe, and he's going into the wall and maybe trying to do something there. Who really knows? Maybe George is playing with that, or maybe not. On the same level of Arson Ice Axe potentially digging to the center of the wall because he understood that there was giant magical weirwood trees there, maybe he understood that there was a central giant magical weirwood at the Night Fort, and he was trying to dig into the wall near there so that he could get to it and destroy it with his ice axe or arson. The idea of a wildling raider who is north of the wall and wants to destroy the wall itself, figuring out its magic and digging to the central heart tree to try cut it down is a really interesting story. I don't think that this is what happened, but it would be absolutely metal as hell if Arson Ice Axe knew that he needed to destroy that tree, so he strapped himself into the tree, and the reason you can still hear him chipping away to this day is basically just because he's trying to chop down the world tree, and he's just there eternally working, sustained by the tree itself, but also trying to cut it down. That would be like a really messed up, very George R. R. Martin situation to find inside the wall. I don't know if it's gonna happen, but it would be really cool. In any case, though, on a very real level, I think part of the reason that the Night Fort is so darn spooky is because there's a bunch of magically animated, forever tortured bodies in the wall fairly nearby. I'm not sure if you could design a better situation to produce ghost stories and hauntings if you wanted to. But okay, looking back again at what we have so far for our suspect list, basically the top tier are Bran the Builder, the Night's King, the Night's Queen, and Craster's sons I'll throw in the top tier because we know that they're casting others, we just don't necessarily know if they're casting all of the others, or if there are other sources as well. Then I would say the Children of the Forest are the A tier because we know in the past they were casting others, but we don't necessarily know if that's the batch of the others that's still around and that we're going to have to deal with in the story. Slightly below them, I would put Bloodraven and also the Green Men just because they're definitely capable of doing so, but I think it's set up a little bit less well than the other options above them. Throw Shiera Seastar in there with Bloodraven as well. A little bit below that, I would have Craster's mom on a different tier, and I also realized there are a few other options that we should quickly add to this C tier as well. Basically, they have the same problem as Craster's mom. They're not entirely set up in the story. These options are just other nameless ancient kings of winter, ancient Starks that are down in the crypts who we don't necessarily have name dropped yet in the books, but could have linked themselves up to the Weirwood at Winterfell and done the same thing that I speculate Bran the Builder did. And in addition to that, just any of the nameless green seers, because we have to assume there are just a bunch of bodies down there in the roots of all these weirwood trees, just like the one at Bloodraven's Cave. At the very least, underneath every weirwood that used to be a child of the forest tree town, which is a lot of them. We know the children of the forest had lots of past green seers, so whether they're children or actual humans, there are probably lots of bodies down there who we've never heard the names of who could have also done this. There are some interesting aspects to it being just random ancient people, sort of like tying it into the collective unconscious and that sort of aspect where it's just the whole of society coming together, and so it doesn't really matter who cast them. But at the same time, I don't think those are as interesting as a lot of the other stuff that we talked about already. This solution definitely still has that shadow of the past hanging over everyone aspect that I think definitely makes it work, but I think it has good reason to deserve a lower place on this tier list. Basically, all of the options down here have the same problem as Craster's mom. They're never really established in the story. The Green Men were barely told about, but we're at least told enough about them that it would make some sense if they were the source of the others. But some nameless random Green Seer, it feels like even less well set up. But again, still plausible, just, in my opinion, one of the more boring of the plausible options. Also, as we try to narrow this down, I wouldn't necessarily be looking for only one answer. As I said, the idea of the others being able to be cast in this way makes them a lot more like dragons, where they can be deployed by multiple different factions, just anyone with the power to control them can use them. Importantly for this discussion, that means that we're not necessarily limited to just picking one option. If you like multiple different options on this tier list, that's definitely plausible. Also, going forward, this tier list could definitely be swayed by good arguments down in the comments, because I'm sure we'll be talking about this subject more in the future. But now that we've gone through everyone that I currently see as worthy of making the tier list, what I would like to do is talk about something else interesting that sort of pops up when you look at this situation. When you view the others as this sort of shadow consciousness projection or this mind meld of potentially the energy of a mother and a father, and potentially the collective unconscious stored within the tree as we talked about earlier, well, then suddenly you realize there are sort of three heads coming together to make the others. much like there are said to be three heads of the dragon. And the dragons and the others are pretty clearly ice and fire counterparts to one another, so that would really make a lot of sense then, wouldn't it? Both of them could actually be a three-headed consciousness merge of ice or fire. This goes back to something I talked about in a video I put out covering the lyrics to the dragon bonding song that Damon was singing in season 1 of House of the Dragon, when it seems like he's trying to get the dragon potentially ready to be tamed and used in a war if needed. He's singing about how two heads to a third sing, and if they're joined as one, they'll fly as they're destined, beautifully and freely. Or something close to that, I'll have the lyrics on the screen. The point being, though, is if the three heads of the dragon represent that a fully tamed dragon is a three-headed mind meld between two heads that inherently make up the dragon, and a third head, which is the rider who can pilot or tame the thing, well, then that's sort of similar to the other being cast of these three parts: the tree and the two parents, one of whom would be piloting the thing. This would be yet another way where the ice and fire magic is mirrored to each other the way that I talked about quite a bit in the last video. If what I speculated about the magic coming from ice and fire moons is correct, this would mean that yeah, the dragons and the others may be even more closely mirrored than we thought. They could be doing similar sorts of magic, merging multiple consciousnesses together to create some sort of new form of powerful magical life. It's also really interesting to think of the others as icy mental magic projections in this way, when you think about how George R. R. Martin originally came to add dragons to his story. According to him, he was originally planning to have the Valyrians just have like mental fire magic. But then he was convinced by a writer friend of his that, no, you have to have dragons, George, it's a fantasy story, and in the end she was right. But I think the ice and fire mental magic was definitely originally a parallel, and the others and the dragons seem to maintain this parallel, both being made up of merged three-headed consciousnesses. Also, much like the dragons and the riders when we see them in House of the Dragon, it's not entirely clear who's always in control of who. You would like to think that the rider's always piloting the dragon, but we see clearly that's not the case. Maybe that's the case with these shadows as well. The others that we see doing evil things out there in the world could be somewhat under the control of the people who originally cast them, but maybe they're partly under the control of that collective shadow of humanity that we talked about earlier. Especially if you're on board with the idea that George is riffing on Jungian psychology and archetypes and stuff with what he's doing with the others and shadow magic, well, then it really does fit really well because if you look at these three heads that might be in control, they're all fitting to Jungian archetypes. The father, the mother, the tree of life, the shadow, all fighting it out to see who's in control of the child. It's all stuff that is kinda right there if this is what George is, as I say, riffing on. He doesn't take a reference from psychology or mythology and just completely copy it one for one in his story, but he does take them and he riffs on them like some sort of jam band. And I think that's what he's doing here. Having all of these different archetypes battling it out for control of the projected shadow other that is being used as a magical weapon is something that I think would be pretty cool and pretty well set up if that's what George wants to do. And given what he said about the battle of good and evil being within the human heart and the battle within ourselves, yeah, I think this is something he would want to do. I think this is actually my favorite answer to the question of who's in control of these shadows once they've been cast. Basically, it's a battle. Much like the battle to control your shadow within you, once you cast a shadow out, you have to control your shadow, or it'll get out of control and potentially destroy humanity. We've seen in House of the Dragon the direct struggles to control these dragons. I think it'd be really interesting if there was a direct struggle to control the others in the same way by whoever created them. And of course, if George is playing with the idea of the psychological shadow and projecting it out onto the other so that you can battle with it, well, then there being this battle to actually control the shadow fits perfectly. That is literally the battle within the human heart that George is talking about when he talks about the fight between good and evil. There are obviously different ways that this mental mind meld could end up working in the end, but all of them seem pretty interesting if it's working somehow along these lines. This sort of mind meld with this dark version of humanity's shadow projected out into the world would potentially make these shadows like a more impulsive, more evil version of whoever cast them, and that could definitely also be pretty interesting. This does also sort of sound like what happens when a Stark is said to have wolf blood. They'll be more impulsive, darker, harsher, whatever you want to say. And this is the way that a lot of the old Starks were. It is sort of interesting when you realize that the Weirwoods seem to be channeling this shadow magic and working on this idea of the psychological shadow, and then you look at the direwolves and the way that they're connected to the Starks, and they are kind of like their shadows. Bran is spending a lot of time trying to control Summer and not let Summer and being a wolf control him. Rickon, many people talk about how he is being turned darker by Shaggy Dog because no one's teaching him to control that relationship. And of course, we see the wolves often do things like growl at people or nip at them or bite at them, even when the Starks themselves are trying to be nice. If we find out this link between a skin changer and its animals is playing on the psychological shadow in some way or another to form this magical link, I don't think that should be surprising at all. I'm sure that's the type of thing that's never going to be fully spelled out and we'll only be able to ever speculate. But since we are speculating, there is also the fact that in Elden Ring, this is basically exactly what happens. You have these half wolf shadows of the Empyreans, who are out there as basically magical helpers to the Empyreans, all following the will of the giant magical tree. Also, as far as I understand it, there is even some dispute as to who's actually in control of these shadows. Normally, the shadows are serving the Empyrean, but they are apparently at the end of the day serving the greater will. So, if an Empyrean were to go against the greater will, the shadow is supposed to serve the greater will rather than the Empyrean. But at one point, apparently, there's a shadow that actually breaks this and serves its Empyrean. It's a whole big thing. I'm not an Elden Ring expert, but I do know there's a bit of conflict as to who's actually supposed to be in control of the shadow. The Empyrean, the Greater Will, and this is sort of similar to what I see going on with the others. George is riffing on a similar magical setup, and the wolves represent the shadow on some level. And of course, in both of these instances, George is referencing a lot of Norse mythology and Odin, being linked up to the World Tree, having ravens and wolves that work for him magically. It's all Odin stuff, but he's definitely riffing on it in both properties, so the wolves being the shadows in both properties does fit pretty well. Many people talk about how John, when he comes back after spending a lot of time in Ghost, may be more wolfish and more impulsive, and you could say maybe more controlled by or in tune with his shadow. I think that if George is actually riffing on Jungian psychology, basically when John dies, he is going to go through the process of meeting his shadow. And how that's going to go is going to determine what he's like when he comes back. There are different ways that it can go when you encounter your shadow psychologically speaking, and I'm not a psychologist, but you can assimilate with the shadow, you can merge with the shadow, you can project the shadow out. There's lots of different stuff. I'm sure we'll have to get into this more when we have a full on John focused video at some point, but we're on tangents within tangents here at this point. But if you want to take a look at trying to figure out what's going to happen to John when he's inside of Ghost, I would say look at meeting your shadow psychologically, and that's probably a pretty good blueprint. There's a lot of really interesting hints on the effects of the mental magic and this connection to the Weirwoods and warging abilities that the Starks have. It seems to go way back in their family, and it definitely seems capable of having an effect on them based on what we see with the modern Starks in our story. So, once you read their whole family history in that way, it really does make sense why they are these harsh kings of winter. Nothing would bring that home in a more direct way than the others themselves being literally these shadows of the ancient Starks. One of the things that you notice about all of the conflicts and problems in these stories is that they're basically these human cycles of revenge and the effects of the past just constantly playing out like a big series of dominoes and causing everyone to fight with each other. Whether it's a cycle of revenge for some family member that was killed long ago, so long ago that you can't even remember their name, or whether it was literally so fresh that it was your father, your brother, your husband, or your wife. These are the human level conflicts that cause actual real world issues. And these cycles of revenge and conflicts are the type of thing that George likes to highlight. So I think that on a magical level, the others being some sort of product of a cycle of revenge or the issues of the past that are still hanging over everyone is really thematically fitting. I think one of the lines in the series that best encapsulates all of this is a line that Tyrion delivers when he's in prison right before Oberyn agrees to become his champion. They're talking about how there has been conflict in their families, and let's remember the only reason Oberyn is there is on a personal quest of revenge, and this is how the exchange goes. Oh, surely. It all goes back and back, Tyrion thought. To our mothers and fathers, and theirs before them. We are puppets, dancing on the strings of those who came before us. And one day, our own children will take up the strings and dance on in our steads. Well, Prince Rhaegar married Elia of Dorne and not Cersei Lannister of Casterly Rock, so it would seem your mother won that tilt. She thought so, Prince Oberyn agreed, but your father is not a man to forget such slights. He taught that lesson to Lord and Lady Tarbeck once, and to the Rains of Castamere, and at King's Landing he taught it to my sister. My helm, Dagos. Manwoody handed it to him, a high golden helm with a copper disc mounted on the brow. The son of Dorne. The visor had been removed, Tyrion saw. Elia and her children have waited long for justice. Prince Oberyn pulled on soft red leather gloves and took up his spear again. But this day they shall have it. It's lines and themes like this that are driven home throughout the books, as well as what George has said about human nature being the true evil, that make me think that the motivation for the others, whatever it is going to come back down to the human nature of whoever it is that cast them. When we're trying to get to the bottom of the motivations for all these shadows, I think it is definitely worth keeping in mind this human element. If they do turn out to be fully intent on destroying humanity, well, then it's likely because they were cast in a situation where that was the goal of the person casting them, either because they were at war with humanity, or because they're so hell-bent on revenge against humanity for something that happened to them that they want to take everyone else out with them. So yeah, even if this massive horde of shadows and the undead is fully intent on wiping out all of humanity, I do think there's going to be something deeper to their motivations and how they actually got to that point. The core of the issue is going to be a human issue and something that has to do with human nature or that pull between good and evil within all of us. I think its solution is also going to have something to do with throwing off those puppet strings that Tyrion was just talking about. Throwing off the shadows of the past and freeing everyone from their control, allowing for a new era of optimism. I think, as I said at the beginning, whoever casts the others is someone who's likely to make that thematically hit home and represent the shadows and puppet strings of the past. I look forward to what all of you down in the comments and the rest of the general theory community does with all of this. I think it's all really interesting stuff, and I can't wait to get some feedback. This was my attempt to go through everything that I currently see as the most plausible explanations as to how the others got there and therefore what I think they would want. But I would love to hear anything that you guys can add to it down there in the comments. This was much more of a sort of scattered discussion talking about many different possibilities, so I'm interested in anything that's popped into your mind at any point throughout all of it. A lot of this video is basically overflow from my last video, so you can kind of look at the last two videos here as just one big, really long video, and there's some more videos that will be coming soon that'll be related. There are many more tangents that are slightly related that I would love to go down, but I think this is where I'm going to cut this video off for today and save all those for future videos. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss them, and maybe share the video with someone who would enjoy it. There's a Patreon down in the description if you're interested. Thank you all very much for making it to the end, and I'll be back with something else very soon.